The year was 1888, the 12th day of January. History would later record it as the Children's Blizzard, a meteorological apocalypse that descended upon the Dakota Territory with the sudden, merciless wrath of a scorned deity. In a matter of minutes, the temperature plummeted from a deceptively mild afternoon thaw to a bone-shattering 40 degrees below zero. The sky did not darken with rain. It shattered into a blinding, horizontal wall of ice crystals driven by hurricane-force winds. In the prosperous, booming railway town of Blackwood, the elite had built monuments to their own arrogance. These were men who believed that a thick ledger of banknotes could somehow bribe the forces of the natural world. They had erected towering, three-story Victorian mansions constructed from imported, kiln-dried pine. They had installed expansive, fragile glass windows shipped from the East Coast to gaze out upon the untamed prairie, and they heated these drafty wooden palaces with massive, cast-iron coal furnaces that cost an astronomical $400, a fortune in that era. But nature is the ultimate auditor of human hubris, and on this day she came to collect. As the blizzard struck, the true fragility of modern, expensive engineering was laid bare. The violent winds tore at the sharp, high-pitched roofs of the mansions, treating them like sails on a sinking ship. Inside the grand parlor of Gideon Vane, the town's wealthiest banker and primary creditor, panic had replaced the usual smug certainty. His massive $400 furnace was glowing a terrifying, cherry-red, consuming coal at an alarming rate. Yet, 3 feet away from the iron belly of the beast, the air was deadly cold. The thin wooden walls offered zero thermal mass. The physics were brutal and unforgiving. The fierce wind outside created a vacuum effect, sucking the heated air right out through the thousands of microscopic gaps in the imported timber and window frames. Frost began to form on the inside of Vane's expensive floral wallpaper. The water in his fine porcelain wash basins froze solid within an hour. Thaddeus Croft, the highly educated architect who had designed these expensive homes, sat shivering in his own freezing study, listening to the agonizing shrieks of the timber frame bending under the wind's sheer force. They had wrapped themselves in the illusion of wealth, completely ignoring the landscape they had invaded. They were freezing to death inside houses that cost thousands of dollars, realizing too late that cold does not respect a man's social standing. 3 miles past the edge of town, out on the barren, unprotected flats where the wind howled without a single tree to break its fury, the storm was even more violent. The whiteout conditions erased the horizon, burying the earth under immense, suffocating drifts of snow. Yet, hidden beneath the howling chaos, buried under a smooth slope of snow that the wind simply glided over, was a low, rounded mound. It was a structure so rudimentary, so utterly devoid of architectural prestige, that the gentlemen in town had openly laughed at it just months prior. It was a stick shed, woven from scavenged willow branches, packed with heavy mud, and bermed deep into the earth. It had cost exactly $7 to build. Inside this humble, earth-hugged womb, there was no howling wind. There was only a profound, heavy, almost sacred silence. While the $400 furnaces in town were failing, a single modest fire crackled lazily in a small stone hearth in the center of the shed. The temperature in the room was a perfectly stable, life-giving 65 degrees. Olenka Varga, a widow who had been exiled and discarded by the very men now freezing in their mansions, sat in a wooden rocking chair. She was not shivering. She was not afraid. The golden light of the flames danced across her calm, weathered face as she quietly knitted a wool sock. A few feet away, her 5-year-old son, Jacek, and her 3-year-old daughter, Mila, were sound asleep. In fact, it was so remarkably warm inside the earthen walls that young Jacek had kicked off his heavy wool blanket in his sleep, his chest rising and falling in deep, peaceful rhythm. Olenka looked at her children, a quiet tear of gratitude shining in the corner of her eye. She had no bank account. She had no formal education in thermodynamics, but she possessed something far more powerful than money: the ancient, ancestral wisdom of the earth. The thick walls of mud and soil surrounding her family did not fight the environment. They absorbed the heat of her tiny fire, storing it like a battery, and gently radiating it back into the room. It was a triumph of humility over arrogance. It was a $7 miracle that would soon humble the greatest minds of the territory. To understand how a destitute, marginalized mother achieved this absolute mastery over the elements, we must return to the bitter autumn that preceded the storm. We must return to the day Olenka's world was shattered, not by the weather, but by the greed of men. Just 3 months earlier, Olenka had stood in the dusty street of Blackwood, holding her children tightly against her skirts. Her husband, a hard-working but unlucky farmer, had perished from a sudden fever, leaving behind a crop that had failed and a debt that had not. Gideon Vane, the banker, did not hesitate to foreclose. The law was the law, he declared, looking down his nose at the grieving widow. With a stroke of a pen, Olenka was stripped of her home, her farm, and her dignity. She was granted nothing but a barren, rocky plot of worthless land on the outskirts of town, a place where nothing grew and where the winter winds were known to be fatal. As she walked away from the life she knew, Olenka reached into her pocket. She had exactly $7 to her name, the entire sum of her family's net worth. It was not enough to buy timber. It was not enough to rent a room. It was barely enough to feed her children for a month. In the eyes of the elite, she was already a ghost, a statistical casualty of the frontier. They expected her to beg. They expected her to freeze, but they did not know the blood that ran in Olenka's veins. They did not know the memories of the old country she carried in her mind, the ancient ways of building that required no sawmills and no banks. With her last $7, she would not buy food, for food would only delay the inevitable. She would buy a heavy iron axe, a sturdy steel shovel, and a box of galvanized nails. She would build a fortress out of dirt and sticks, and in doing so, she would unknowingly plant the seeds of an empire. Before we witness the grueling, step-by-step construction of this marvel of low-tech engineering, and before we watch the arrogant elite crawl through the snow to beg this widow for their lives, I ask you to join our community. If you believe that ancient wisdom and the humble strength of a parent can outmatch the arrogance of modern elites, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this story of true resilience. Tell me in the comments below, from which city in the world are you watching this legacy unfold today? Now, let us return to the unforgiving autumn plains, where a mother with hands blistered and bleeding began to dig into the frozen earth, preparing to teach the world a lesson in survival. The October wind sweeping across the Dakota plains did not howl, it hissed. It was a dry, creeping cold that snaked through the tall, dying prairie grass, carrying with it the undeniable metallic scent of an approaching, merciless winter. Out here, on the very edge of the Blackwood settlement, the land offered no apologies and no shelter. This was Lot 42, a discarded barren slope of rocky earth, completely exposed to the northern gales. It was the piece of geography Gideon Vane, the banker, had casually tossed to Olenka Varga after seizing her late husband's fertile farm. Olenka arrived at this desolate patch of dirt, pulling a dilapidated wooden handcart. Her boots crunched heavily against the frost-hardened ground. Behind her, holding tightly to the frayed fabric of her heavy wool coat, were 5-year-old Jacek and 3-year-old Mila. The children's faces were already flushed pink from the biting wind, their small bodies shivering beneath garments that were entirely inadequate for the season that was about to descend upon them. There was no house waiting for them. There was no foundation. There was only the vast, indifferent sky, the hard earth beneath their feet, and an oppressive silence that threatened to swallow them whole. Olenka stopped the cart and let the wooden handles drop to the ground with a hollow thud. She did not weep. The luxury of despair had been stolen from her the moment her husband's coffin was lowered into the ground. When you are a mother with 2 innocent lives looking up at you, waiting for salvation, you do not have the time to mourn your pride. You only have the time to survive. From the bottom of the cart, Olenka retrieved her entire net worth, the absolute sum of her financial existence in this world. It was not a leather pouch of silver coins. It was not a paper deed. It was 3 objects purchased with her final $7: a heavy, broad-headed steel shovel, a forged iron axe with a sturdy hickory handle, and a single, heavy wooden box filled to the brim with coarse, galvanized nails. $7. In town, that amount would barely buy a gentleman a decent tailored coat. It would perhaps purchase 2 bottles of imported French wine for a banker's dinner party. But in Olenka's calloused, trembling hands, these tools were not mere metal and wood. They were the instruments of her family's salvation. They were the keys to unlocking the ancient, quiet power of the earth itself. She walked to the northernmost edge of the slope, where the earth rose into a small, natural mound. She kissed the top of Mila's head, ruffled Jacek's hair, and whispered softly in her native tongue, promising them a warm hearth. Then, she drove the steel shovel into the frozen dirt. The jarring vibration shot up her arms, a painful reminder of her own physical fragility. But she pressed her boot down, bearing her weight onto the shovel, and lifted the first clod of dark, heavy Dakota soil. She dug. Hour after hour, while the children huddled together under a blanket in the cart, Olenka carved a deep, rectangular trench into the side of the hill. She was not building a house upon the earth. She was carving a womb into it. It was mid-afternoon when the rhythmic scraping of her shovel was interrupted by the sharp, rhythmic clopping of hooves and the crunch of iron-rimmed wheels. A lacquered carriage, its black paint gleaming arrogantly under the pale autumn sun, rolled to a halt on the rough dirt road just a few yards from her plot. From the plush leather seats of the carriage looked down 2 men wrapped in thick beaver pelt coats. One was Gideon Vane, the banker who held Olenka's ruined life in his ledgers. Beside him sat Thaddeus Croft, the town's premier architect, a man whose formal education on the East Coast had convinced him he was the master of all physical laws. They were inspecting the outskirts of town for a future lumber mill, but the sight of the widowed woman digging in the dirt was a spectacle they could not resist. "Well, well, Mrs. Varga." Gideon Vane's voice drifted over the wind, dripping with a condescension so thick it almost had a physical weight. "Digging a grave already? Or have you lost your mind to the grief?" Olenka paused. She leaned on the handle of her shovel, her chest heaving, sweat freezing on her brow. She looked up at the carriage, her eyes dark, calm, and utterly devoid of the subservience they expected. Thaddeus Croft adjusted his spectacles, his gaze shifting from Olenka to a large pile of flexible green willow branches she had spent the early morning dragging from a distant creek. "I am a man of science, Mrs. Varga," Croft said, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "And as an architect, I must confess, your methodology eludes me. You have no foundation stones. You have no milled timber. What exactly are you attempting to construct with a pile of twigs and a hole in the ground?" "A home," Olenka replied, her voice steady. carrying over the wind like a physical blow. The two wealthy men erupted into roaring laughter, their breath pluming in the freezing air. "A home," Croft sneered, leaning over the side of the carriage. "Madam, this is the Dakota Territory, not a savage jungle. You cannot stop a 30-degree below-zero blizzard with sticks and mud. It defies all principles of modern engineering. You need thick, kiln-dried pine. You need overlapping joints, mortise and tenon. You need vertical, load-bearing walls. The wind will snap those little willow twigs in an hour, and whatever mud you slap on them will freeze and crack before December. You are building a frozen tomb." "And what of the heat?" Vane chimed in, tapping his silver-tipped cane against the carriage floor. "I have just imported a magnificent cast-iron coal furnace for my parlor. It cost me $400. $400! It requires 3 tons of coal to run through the winter. Tell me, Mrs. Varga, what is the budget for your architectural marvel?" $7, Olenka said quietly. Vane threw his head back and laughed so hard his face turned red. $7, a $7 stick shed against the wrath of God. You are fighting mathematics, woman. You are fighting physics, and you will lose. When the snow flies, that hole in the ground will be a block of solid ice. If you have any sense of maternal duty, you will march those children to the orphanage in town before you kill them." They did not understand. They looked at the world through the lens of price tags, factories, and arrogant dominion over nature. They believed that if something did not cost a fortune, it had no value. They looked at the mud and saw only dirt. They did not know that the Earth is the oldest, most powerful thermal blanket in the universe. They did not know that Olenka's ancestors had survived Ice Age winters, not with fragile, expensive wood, but by allying themselves with the sheer, undeniable mass of the planet. Olenka did not argue with them. She did not try to explain the complex thermodynamics of what she was about to build. She simply turned her back to the lacquered carriage, raised her heavy steel shovel, and drove it violently into the earth once more. "Let the savage play in the mud, Thaddeus," Vane said, pulling his thick fur collar tight around his neck. "She'll be begging at our back doors for a scrap of warmth by Thanksgiving." The driver cracked the whip, and the carriage rolled away, the sound of their arrogant laughter slowly fading into the vast, howling emptiness of the plains. Olenka was left alone once again. She looked at her hands, raw and bleeding. She looked at her shivering children, and then she looked at the pile of willow branches. The experts had spoken. They had promised her death, but as she began to weave the first sticks together, weaving a pattern as old as humanity itself, she knew something the arrogant men in their imported mansions would soon learn the hard way. Nature does not care how much money you have in the bank, and she was about to use the very earth beneath their feet to humiliate them all. When the lacquered carriage of the bankers disappeared over the horizon, leaving only the biting wind in its wake, Olenka Varga did not weep. She closed her eyes, standing alone on the desolate prairie, and listened. She was not listening to the mocking echoes of Thaddeus Croft, the educated architect. She was listening to the silent voices of her ancestors, echoing from a distant, frozen continent. She remembered the hands of her grandmother, wrinkled and caked in clay, building warmth from the very dirt they stood upon. The wealthy men in Blackwood believed that civilization meant conquering nature, building walls to fight the wind, and burning mountains of expensive coal to fight the cold. But Olenka's lineage knew a deeper, older truth. You cannot defeat winter in a frontal assault. You must negotiate with it. You must surrender your arrogance and let the earth itself shield you. Her first act of defiance against the approaching blizzard was not to build up, but to dig down. This was the fundamental principle of passive geothermal insulation, a concept the East Coast architects completely ignored in their pursuit of towering, ostentatious facades. While the elite built their $2,000 timber mansions directly on top of the freezing surface, fully exposed to the catastrophic temperature drops of the atmosphere, Olenka used her heavy steel shovel to carve a trench 3 feet deep into the side of the hill. She understood, through generational wisdom, a profound physical reality. The frost only penetrates so far. While the air temperature above ground might drop to a lethal 40 degrees below zero, the soil 3 feet down remains entirely ignorant of the winter. It holds a constant, naturally sustained temperature of around 50 to 55 degrees, warmed by the immense insulating crust of the planet itself. By sinking her floor below the frost line and piling the excavated earth high against the north-facing walls in a thick berm, Olenka was not just blocking the wind, she was physically connecting her home to the Earth's permanent thermal baseline. The planet itself was becoming her furnace, and it cost her nothing but the sweat on her brow. Once the excavation was complete, Olenka turned to the pile of green, flexible willow branches she had scavenged from the creek bed. She did not have the money for rigid, kiln-dried pine boards, nor did she want them. Rigid wood fights the wind, taking the full brunt of the kinetic energy until, eventually, it snaps. Instead, Olenka began to weave. She drove the thickest branches deep into the ground along the perimeter of her trench, spacing them a hand's width apart. Then, taking the thinner, more pliable shoots, she wove them horizontally in and out of the upright posts, creating a tight, incredibly strong basket-like framework known as wattle. But the true genius of her design lay in the roof. She did not build a sharp, high-pitched gable like the grand houses in town. High roofs are sails that catch the devastating prairie gales, creating high-pressure zones on the windward side and violent structural vacuums on the leeward side. Olenka, guided by the physics of survival, bent the long, flexible willow saplings into a smooth, low-profile dome. When the catastrophic winds arrived, they would not find a flat wall to destroy. They would hit the curved surface and be forced to glide smoothly over the top, following the aerodynamic path of least resistance, just as a roaring river flows harmlessly over a smooth, rounded stone. With the woven skeleton complete, Olenka faced the most grueling, physically punishing phase of her labor, the daub. Down by the half-frozen creek, she used her shovel to mine heavy, iron-rich clay. She hauled it back to the site in her wooden cart, bucket by agonizing bucket. She mixed the wet clay with coarse sand and armfuls of dry, yellow prairie grass. The sand provided structural friction, while the long fibers of the dry grass acted exactly like steel rebar in modern concrete, giving the mud immense tensile strength to prevent cracking. Because she had no mixing machinery and her hands were already blistered and bleeding, Olenka took off her boots. In the freezing October air, with the wind biting at her exposed skin, she stepped into the pit of freezing mud and began to stomp. She churned the earth, the water, and the grass with her bare feet, shivering violently as the icy mixture numbed her toes. Her 3-year-old daughter, Mila, watched from the cart, wrapped in a blanket, her big eyes tracking her mother's silent, agonizing dance. Olenka smiled at her through chapped lips, hiding the sharp, shooting pains in her legs. This is what love looks like, she thought. It is not a $400 check written to a contractor. It is freezing your own blood so your children will not have to. Once the mixture reached the consistency of thick, heavy dough, Olenka began to apply it. She scooped up massive handfuls of the freezing mud and slammed it into the woven willow framework, pressing it deep into the gaps, smoothing it over the branches, building walls that were nearly 2 feet thick. This was the very process that Thaddeus Croft, the educated architect, had so cruelly mocked. "Mud holds no fire," he had sneered from his lacquered carriage. But Croft's expensive education had a fatal blind spot. He understood aesthetics, but he did not understand thermal mass. The $2,000 wooden mansions in town were built with thin, hollow walls. Wood is an insulator. It slows the transfer of heat, but it has almost zero capacity to store it. The moment Gideon Vane's massive $400 coal furnace went out, his wooden parlor would drop to freezing within an hour. The air inside would vanish. Olenka's mud walls, however, were a thermal battery. When the massive, 2-foot-thick envelope of earth and clay finally dried, it would transform into a monolithic, stone-like shell. Thermal mass dictates that dense materials absorb heat energy slowly and release it just as slowly. Olenka built a small, modest hearth of river stones in the exact center of the domed room. She didn't need 3 tons of expensive coal. She only needed a small, steady fire of scavenged twigs and dried buffalo dung. During the day, that tiny fire would burn, and the dense, heavy earthen walls would silently drink in the heat, storing it deep within the molecular structure of the dried clay. At night, when the fire died down to mere embers, the walls would activate. They would slowly and evenly radiate that stored heat back into the living space, creating an unbreakable, perfectly stable envelope of warmth. While the temperature outside fluctuated wildly, the temperature inside the earthen womb would remain locked in a state of thermal inertia. Furthermore, Olenka understood the mechanics of air. An airtight room suffocates its inhabitants, but a drafty room freezes them. To solve this, she utilized her $7 investment. She used the galvanized nails to fashion a simple, ingenious ventilation system out of hollowed-out logs. She placed one small pipe low to the ground near the door, drawing in fresh, heavy oxygen. She placed another pipe at the very apex of the domed roof. As the fire burned, the naturally rising warm air would slowly push the stale smoke out of the top vent, creating a gentle, calculated vacuum that pulled fresh air in from the bottom. A continuous, self-regulating lung powered entirely by natural thermodynamics. For 3 weeks, Olenka labored from dawn until dusk. Her hands became rough as sandstone. Her back ached with a permanent, dull fire. But as November arrived and the first light dustings of snow began to fall, the $7 stick shed was complete. It was an ugly thing to the untrained eye. A brown, lumpy mound of dried earth protruding from the side of a hill, looking more like an animal's den than a human dwelling. The gentlemen of Blackwood rode past it on their horses, pointing and laughing, securing their bets on which week of January the widow and her children would be found, frozen solid inside their mud tomb. They returned to their towering pine mansions, stoked their roaring, expensive furnaces, and poured their imported wines, utterly convinced of their superiority. They felt secure in their wealth, completely unaware that the barometric pressure was already beginning to drop. They did not know that a mass of Arctic air, colder and more violent than anything recorded in human history, was currently gathering strength over the Canadian plains, preparing to test the true value of their arrogance. The morning of January 12th dawned with a cruel, deceptive gentleness. The bitter cold of the previous weeks had suddenly vanished, replaced by a strangely warm, humid breeze that melted the surface of the snow into a soft slush. In the town of Blackwood, the gentlemen left their heavy beaver pelt coats on their mahogany coat racks. Children were sent to the schoolhouse in light sweaters. Thaddeus Croft, standing on the porch of his newly constructed $2,000 timber frame office, remarked to a passing banker that the worst of the winter was surely behind them. They were utterly blind to the barometric catastrophe unfolding in the upper atmosphere. Just past noon, the southern horizon did not just darken, it bruised. A colossal wall of bruised purple clouds, churning with the kinetic violence of a displaced Arctic air mass, began to roll across the Dakota plains. There was no gentle transition. The temperature did not gradually drop. It plummeted in a terrifying sheer cliff of thermodynamics. In the span of exactly 3 minutes, the balmy 35 degrees above zero was violently erased, replaced by a lung-searing 40 degrees below zero. But it was not just the cold. It was the wind. It struck the town of Blackwood not as a breeze, but as a horizontal avalanche of pulverized ice crystals, traveling at 70 miles per hour. It was the White Death. Inside his sprawling 3-story Victorian mansion, Gideon Vane, the banker, was abruptly thrown from his leather armchair as the entire $2,000 timber structure shrieked in agony. The kinetic force of the blizzard slammed into the flat, vertical walls of the house with the weight of a freight train. The high-pitched, ornamental roof, designed for East Coast aesthetics rather than prairie survival, caught the hurricane-force winds like the sail of a doomed galleon. Upstairs, the expensive glass of the imported bay windows bowed inward under the immense atmospheric pressure, shivering violently before microfractures began to spiderweb across the panes. Vane scrambled across his Persian rug, his breath already visible in the air, and threw open the iron door of his massive $400 coal furnace. He shoveled coal into the belly of the beast with frantic, trembling hands, desperate to ignite a roaring blaze. 3 miles away, out on the desolate, unprotected plains of Lot 42, the very same apocalyptic wind came screaming for Olenka Varga. It tore across the flat earth, a scythe of freezing death, seeking out the $7 stick Shed the elite had mocked. But when the 70-mile-per-hour gale hit Olenka's home, it found no flat walls to batter. It found no sharp roofline to rip apart. It encountered only a smooth, frozen dome of earth, bermed directly into the hillside. The devastating kinetic energy of the storm was instantly neutralized by simple, ancestral aerodynamics. The wind was forced to glide harmlessly up and over the curved structure, compressing the snow against the mud walls, effectively adding another thick layer of natural freezing insulation to the exterior. Back in the wealthy center of Blackwood, Gideon Vane's $400 furnace was roaring, the cast iron glowing a terrifying volatile orange. Yet he was freezing to death in his own parlor. The thermodynamics of his expensive home had completely collapsed. The thin, kiln-dried pine walls offered absolutely zero thermal mass. As the furnace pumped out heat, the violent 70-mile-per-hour winds outside created a catastrophic vacuum effect. The low-pressure zones ripping across the leeward side of the mansion literally sucked the warm air out through the thousands of microscopic gaps between the expensive floorboards, the window casings, and the roof joints. The heat was being stolen faster than the coal could burn it. Frost, thick, jagged, and white, began to crystallize on the inside of Vane's floral wallpaper. The water in his fine crystal decanter froze so rapidly that the glass shattered with a sharp crack, spilling a block of solid ice onto his mahogany table. Inside the earthen womb of the $7 shed, there was no sound of shattering glass. There was no shrieking timber. There was only a profound, heavy, almost sacred silence. The 2-foot-thick walls of dried mud, sand, and woven willow branches did not move a fraction of an inch. Olenka sat in her wooden rocking chair, a patchwork quilt draped loosely over her lap, the air around her thick, still, and heavy with warmth. The small fire of dried twigs and buffalo dung in the central stone hearth was barely more than a collection of glowing red embers. Yet the temperature in the room was a perfectly stable, life-giving 65 degrees. In Thaddeus Croft's architectural marvel of an office, the educated man was reduced to a whimpering, primal state of terror. He had wrapped himself in 3 layers of wool and a heavy rug, huddled in the corner of his study. His theories of vertical load-bearing walls and mortise and tenon joints were useless against the wrath of the planet. The wood of his building was freezing, shrinking, and warping under the extreme drop in temperature. Nails popped violently from the joists like erratic gunfire. The cold was no longer just a temperature, it was a physical predator, biting at his exposed fingers, turning his lips blue, slowing the blood in his veins to a lethargic crawl. His $2,000 education and his expensive building materials had trapped him in a beautifully designed, rapidly freezing tomb. Olenka, however, simply reached out and placed one single small piece of dried wood onto her embers. She did not need a roaring $400 coal fire. Her architectural marvel had already done the work. The immense thermal mass of the heavy clay walls had spent the entire morning drinking in the gentle heat of her small fire. Now, as the apocalypse raged outside, those walls were faithfully discharging that stored energy, radiating a gentle, multi-directional warmth that wrapped around her family like a physical embrace. She looked over at her bed. 5-year-old Jacek and 3-year-old Mila were sound asleep, their chests rising and falling in slow, peaceful rhythms. Jacek had even pushed his blanket off his shoulders, his skin warm and flushed. The geothermal connection to the deep earth beneath the 3-foot trench held the baseline temperature steady, utterly ignoring the 40 below zero chaos happening just 30 inches away on the other side of the mud wall. In the town, the arrogant elite were beginning to realize that all the gold in their bank vaults could not buy them a single degree of warmth. They were freezing in the dark, their expensive furnaces failing against the sheer, unbridled vacuum of the storm, their bodies trembling violently as the early stages of hypothermia set in. They had mocked the dirt. They had laughed at the sticks. They had scoffed at a mother's $7 investment. But as the night fell and the White Death tightened its grip on the Dakota Plains, the only safe haven, the only mathematically and thermodynamically sound structure within 50 miles, was a pile of mud built by a marginalized widow. The pendulum of justice had swung, and by dawn, the very men who had exiled Olenka Varga would be forced to drag their frozen, broken bodies through the snow, praying that the woman in the dirt shed would have enough mercy to let them inside. The morning of January 13th broke with a blinding crystalline clarity. The apocalyptic winds of the White Death had finally exhausted themselves, leaving behind a sky of pale, indifferent blue. But the silence that blanketed the Dakota Territory was not a peaceful one. It was the heavy, paralyzed silence of a frozen graveyard. The temperature lingered at a lethal 35 degrees below zero. In the town of Blackwood, the illusion of human supremacy had been entirely shattered. The grand $2,000 timber mansions that had once stood as monuments to financial arrogance were now structural ruins. The extreme, violent drop in temperature, combined with the hurricane-force winds, had caused the rigid, kiln-dried pine to snap and warp. Expensive glass windows lay shattered on imported Persian rugs, buried under heavy snowdrifts that had invaded the parlors. Gideon Vane, the ruthless banker who had evicted a grieving widow to secure his ledgers, was no longer a master of the universe. He was a broken, shivering man, wrapped in 3 layers of beaver pelts, his lips a terrifying shade of blue. His $400 cast-iron furnace sat dead and silent in the center of the room, entirely out of coal, having lost its war against the vacuum of the storm. Beside him was Thaddeus Croft, the East Coast architect. Croft was weeping silently, his hands wrapped in torn woolen blankets, his rigid theories of modern engineering lying in frozen tatters around him. They knew, with the primal certainty of dying animals that they would not survive another night. The town's expensive infrastructure had completely collapsed. There was no heat, no shelter, and no salvation to be bought with banknotes. "The widow," Vane croaked, his voice barely a raspy whisper against the agonizing cold. "Lot 42. Croft looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and shame. "She is dead, Gideon. We all know it. A mudshed, a $7 pile of twigs. The wind must have scattered it to the next county. We will only find a frozen tomb." "If we stay here, we are already in a tomb," Vane replied, struggling to his feet, his frozen joints popping in the silent room. Driven by the ultimate, degrading instinct of sheer survival, the two wealthiest men in the territory pushed open their heavy, warped front doors and stepped out into the waist-deep snow. The journey of 3 miles to the outskirts of town was an agonizing, humiliating crawl. They dragged their expensive leather boots through the drifts, their lungs burning as if inhaling crushed glass, their tears freezing instantly upon their cheeks. They were no longer elite gentlemen. They were beggars, crawling toward the very dirt they had mocked. When they finally crested the hill overlooking Lot 42, they stopped. They braced themselves to see the ruined, frozen corpses of a mother and her 2 children. Instead, they saw a miracle of fluid dynamics and thermal mass. The $7 stick shed was not destroyed. It was not even damaged. The violent winds had simply packed the snow in a perfect aerodynamic ramp over the curved willow roof, creating an igloo-like shell that only added to the structure's immense insulation. And there, rising from the small wooden vent at the very apex of the buried dome, was a steady, defiant ribbon of white smoke. It was the smoke of a fire. It was the breath of life. Trembling uncontrollably, shedding their dignity into the snow, the banker and the architect threw themselves at the heavy timber door Olenka had fashioned from scavenged wood. They pounded on it with their numb, frost-bitten fists. "Please!" Vane screamed, a sound devoid of all his former arrogance. "Mrs. Varga, in the name of God, please!" A moment later, the heavy latch lifted. The door swung open. What hit the 2 men was not just air, it was a physical, overwhelmingly beautiful wall of pure, stable, 65-degree heat. It smelled of baked clay, dry prairie grass, and the faint, sweet scent of boiling tea. It was the scent of salvation. Standing in the doorway was Olenka Varga. She did not look like a victim. She looked like a queen standing in the foyer of an indestructible fortress. Her children, Jacek and Mila, were sitting on a woven rug on the dry earth floor, playing with carved wooden blocks, completely oblivious to the mass casualty event that had just devastated the territory. Olenka looked at the 2 men. She looked at the ice in their beards, the blue in their skin, and the desperate, pathetic terror in their eyes. She had every right to close the door. She had every right to let the men who had stolen her farm freeze to death on her doorstep. It would have been a cold, logical justice. But Olenka was not a creature of Wall Street or high society. She was a mother, deeply connected to the earth, and the earth does not hold petty grudges. It simply sustains. Her superiority was not rooted in vengeance, but in absolute, untouchable grace. She stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in out of the cold, gentlemen," she said softly. "The earth has enough warmth for us all." Vane and Croft collapsed across the threshold, falling to their knees on the warm dirt floor. They crawled toward the central stone hearth, holding their frozen, trembling hands out toward the modest fire of twigs and buffalo dung. They stared at the 2-foot-thick walls of mud and wattle. They finally understood the physics they had mocked. The heavy mass of the earth was radiating heat back at them, a slow, steady pulse of thermal energy that no expensive, drafty wooden wall could ever replicate. Thaddeus Croft, the educated architect, touched the rock-hard, warm clay wall. He looked up at the illiterate widow. "I was a fool," he whispered, a single tear cutting through the soot on his face. "All my books, all my equations. I knew nothing. You have built a masterpiece for $7. That brutal winter of 1888 changed the Dakota Territory forever, but it changed Olenka Varga's destiny the most. When the spring thaw finally arrived, the wealthy elites of Blackwood surveyed their ruined, cracked mansions. They realized that their imported aesthetics were suicidal in the face of the prairie's wrath. Gideon Vane, forever changed by the night he spent begging on a dirt floor, did not foreclose on Lot 42. Instead, he approached Olenka with a different piece of paper, a massive business contract. The town needed to rebuild, and they did not want Thaddeus Croft's thin wooden boxes. They wanted the Varga method. Olenka, driven solely by the desire to secure her children's future, accepted. She began to teach. She trained crews of men to harvest willow, to mix the exact ratio of clay, sand, and grass, and to calculate the precise depth of the geothermal frost line. She patented her curved, aerodynamic roof designs and her passive ventilation tubes. The woman who had been exiled with $7 became the chief architectural consultant for the entire region. Years later, when the United States government conducted the federal census, the agent knocked on the door of a massive, beautifully designed, earth-bermed estate on the edge of town. When he asked for her occupation, Olenka Varga was not recorded as a homemaker or a widow. She was officially registered in the Federal Archives as a professor of practical construction techniques. She never abandoned the principles of thermal mass, and she never built a house she couldn't heat with a handful of twigs. Her business empire expanded across 3 states, providing affordable, indestructible, climate-resilient homes to thousands of frontier families. Decades later, in her twilight years, an overeager Eastern newspaper caught wind of a false rumor and accidentally printed her obituary prematurely. Olenka sat in her rocking chair, inside her warm, perfectly silent earthen parlor, sipping tea as she read the headline, "The millionaire mud builder of the Dakota Plains passes away." She was the wealthiest, wisest woman on the frontier. She smiled, folded the newspaper, and tossed it into the small, efficient fire. She had outlived her enemies. She had outlived their arrogance. She had turned $7, a steel shovel, and the dirt beneath her feet into a legacy of millions, proving once and for all that true wealth is not the money you hoard, but the harmony you build with the world around you. If the story of Olenka Varga stirred something deep within you, if you believe that ancestral wisdom, profound humility, and the unbreakable spirit of a parent will always triumph over the cold arrogance of the elite, then you belong here with us. Please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this audio documentary with someone who needs to be reminded of the power of resilience. This channel is a manifesto. It is a rebellion against the modern lie that everything must be expensive to be valuable, and that humanity must fight nature instead of learning from it. We are the guardians of the old ways. Before you go, I want to know who is standing with us. Tell me in the comments below. From which city and country are you watching this legacy unfold? Until our next journey into history, remember, the winds will always howl, and the elites will always boast. But the earth remains steady for those who know how to listen. Stay humble, stay strong, and protect your own.